It was another ordinary morning when Ethan Harper left his apartment for school. The walk was familiar, just a 15-minute stretch past cracked sidewalks, empty storefronts, and old houses. The gray sky hung over the neighborhood like a heavy blanket, and Ethan's thoughts were focused on his history test later that day. His backpack felt heavier than usual, but that was probably because of the last-minute studying. But then the sirens hit. At first, Ethan didn't notice anything out of the ordinary, but as he rounded the corner, he saw the flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the windows of the corner store. A group of officers was gathered outside, talking to the store owner. There was a broken window, yellow tape marking off the scene. Ethan slowed his pace, adjusting his hoodie and glancing at the scene. What was going on? He didn't have time to figure it out before he heard the shout. "Hands where I can see them!" Ethan's body froze, his heart thumping in his chest. He didn't even have time to process what was happening before Officer Brian Shaw, a local cop known more for harassing people than protecting them, was charging toward him. Shaw's hand hovered near his holster as he shouted again, "Now!" Ethan instinctively raised his hands, his pulse racing. "What's going on?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. But his confusion was clear. Shaw didn't respond. In one swift motion, he grabbed Ethan's wrist, twisting it behind his back with enough force to send a shock of pain up his shoulder. The other hand slammed down on Ethan's other wrist, locking it in a pair of cold cuffs. "What did I do?" Ethan stammered, his mind still struggling to catch up. "We've got him," Shaw said, barking into his radio. "Got who?" Ethan asked, trying to understand, but his voice cracked. "You're the one. We've got you on security footage near the store when it got hit," Shaw muttered. "You match the description." Ethan's mind was racing. "What description? I wasn't even near that store. I'm just walking to school." Shaw scoffed. "Dark hoodie, sneakers, young black male. Sounds about right." A small crowd had gathered now, people slowing their cars, some of them pulling out their phones to record, but no one stepped forward to challenge Shaw. The officers shoved Ethan toward the squad car, and his stomach churned. He couldn't believe this was happening. The door of the squad car slammed shut behind him. Ethan's heart hammered against his chest. The car smelled of old leather and sweat, the air thick with tension. The handcuffs were too tight, digging into his wrists as he sat stiffly, trying not to move. Every shift in his posture made them bite deeper into his skin. The ride to the station was short, but to Ethan it felt like hours. The officer driving didn't speak to him. He barely acknowledged Ethan's existence, his attention focused elsewhere. When they arrived at the station, Ethan was pulled out of the car and shoved inside. The station was cold, the kind of cold that sank into your bones. Fluorescent lights buzzed above, and the officers led him to a chair where they took his name, his fingerprints, and even his shoelaces. Ethan felt numb. He was being treated like a criminal, but he hadn't done anything wrong. This wasn't real, was it? A weary-eyed officer left the room, and Ethan sat in silence, staring at the cold floor. Then the door opened, and his mother, Janet Harper, stormed in, her eyes immediately locking on Ethan. She checked him over for any signs of harm before turning her glare on the officer. "Where is his lawyer?" Janet demanded, voice sharp. "What is he being charged with?" Shaw stepped forward, arms crossed. "We've got him on footage. The store was broken into. Goods were stolen. He fits the description." Janet's nostrils flared. "And what description is that?" "Dark hoodie, sneakers, young black male." Ethan's mother clenched her jaw, her hands forming fists at her sides. But she didn't shout. She just took a deep breath, trying to keep her composure. "My son was walking to school." "Yeah, that's what you say," Shaw muttered, clearly dismissive. Ethan sat there, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The fear and confusion bubbled inside him, but there was nothing he could do. His life had just changed in an instant, and the worst part was, he had no idea how to stop it. The fluorescent lights above flickered, casting an eerie hum over the stark, sterile room. Ethan Harper sat still, trying to steady his nerves, but nothing seemed to calm the storm brewing inside him. His wrists still stung from the handcuffs, and his mind raced with questions. Why was he here? What had he done wrong? All he wanted was to be home, back in his room, buried in his history books. The door swung open and Janet Harper, Ethan's mother, stormed into the room, her eyes immediately locking onto her son. She scanned his face, checking for any signs of harm, before her gaze turned to the officers. "Where is his lawyer?" Janet demanded, voice sharp like a blade. "What's he even being charged with?" Ethan could see the worry in his mother's eyes. She was strong, tough, and had worked 2 jobs to keep a roof over their heads, but right now he could see the fear creeping in. Fear for him, fear of what was happening. "Your son was caught on security footage near a crime scene," Officer Shaw said, his voice flat. "The store was broken into. Tools were stolen. He fits the description." "And that description is?" Janet's voice trembled with fury as she stepped forward. "Dark hoodie, sneakers, young black male," Shaw repeated. Janet's nostrils flared as her hands balled into fists. She was trying so hard to stay calm, to keep her composure, but the anger was there. Ethan could feel it radiating off her. "My son was walking to school," she said, her words cutting through the tension in the room. Shaw shrugged, clearly indifferent. "That's what you say." Ethan felt like the world was closing in on him. This wasn't real. He had done nothing wrong. But how could he prove it? It was his word against theirs, and it seemed like the system had already decided his fate. Minutes later, a man in a wrinkled suit walked into the room, flipping through a file as if he'd just skimmed Ethan's case. Mark Jenkins, the public defender assigned to Ethan, didn't look up from his papers when he spoke. "They're offering a plea deal," he said, sounding exhausted. "A plea deal?" Janet snapped. "What do you mean?" "If Ethan pleads guilty, he can avoid a trial, get probation and community service," Jenkins said, finally looking up. "It's the best option." Ethan's stomach dropped. Best option? Plead guilty for something he didn't do. His hands curled into fists at his sides. "No," Janet said, her voice cold, resolute. "We're not signing anything." Jenkins sighed, the kind of sigh that suggested he'd heard this all before. "Listen, I get it, but these cases rarely go well. It's his word against the police officers. A trial could drag on for months and the odds are stacked against you." Ethan looked at his mother, his heart pounding in his chest. This wasn't just about his future. This was about his entire life being turned upside down, and the system didn't seem to care. "We're not taking the deal," Janet said firmly. "But..." Jenkins started to protest, but Janet cut him off. "No," she snapped. "My son is innocent. We're not pleading guilty to something he didn't do." Ethan's fingers dug into the metal armrest of the chair. His mom was right. There was no way they were going to accept this plea deal. But even though his mother was standing up for him, Ethan could feel the weight of the system bearing down on him. The police, the prosecutor, the court, they were all already treating him like a criminal. How could he fight back when it seemed like everyone had already decided what happened? Ethan swallowed hard, the lump in his throat refusing to go away. "What do we do now?" he asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Janet looked down at him, her expression softening for a brief moment. "We fight," she said simply, her voice filled with determination. "We fight this, Ethan. We fight until we prove you didn't do anything wrong." But as the words left her mouth, Ethan couldn't shake the nagging feeling that it wasn't just his freedom at stake. It was the system that was failing him, failing kids like him. And the hardest part was, no one was listening. Later that night, as Ethan lay in his bed staring at the ceiling, he couldn't stop thinking about what his mom had said. He knew she was right. But how could they fight back when the whole system seemed against them? He wasn't a lawyer. He didn't know anything about the law. But as the hours ticked by, one thing became clear. If no one else was going to fight for him, then it was up to him to fight for himself. The next few days were a blur of confusion, frustration, and fear. Ethan sat in his room, the weight of the world pressing down on him. Every time he tried to focus on something, his schoolwork, his friends, his mind would wander back to the trial. The court date was coming fast, and the thought of being stuck in a system that already seemed to have its mind made up made his stomach turn. But then one day something changed. Ethan realized that if he was going to get out of this mess, he needed to take control. He couldn't just sit back and hope someone would save him. He had to save himself. He knew nothing about the law, not really, but he had an idea. If no one else was going to fight for him, then he would have to learn how to fight back. And he started where he could, the school library. The legal section wasn't very large, mostly outdated textbooks and dusty reference materials, but it was all he had. He spent hours there, flipping through thick books on criminal procedure, trying to piece together what little he could understand. His fingers ached from taking notes, and his eyes burned from reading so many words that didn't quite make sense at first. But as the days went by, things started to click. Ethan wasn't just reading, he was learning. He read about the burden of proof. The prosecution had to prove his guilt, not the other way around. He studied the chain of evidence. If the police mishandled the evidence, it could be thrown out. He even read about cross-examination, how a lawyer could tear apart a witness's testimony by pointing out inconsistencies. The more Ethan read, the clearer it became. They had nothing on him. No fingerprints, no stolen goods. And that grainy footage? It wasn't enough. Not by a long shot. He was just a kid, but he wasn't going to let this happen without a fight. One afternoon, as he sat hunched over a thick legal book, the librarian, Mr. Langford, approached. His round glasses caught the light as he peered down at the stack of books Ethan had pulled from the shelves. "What's all this?" Mr. Langford asked, his voice low but kind. Ethan hesitated for a moment. He could lie, say it was for a school project, but something about Mr. Langford's knowing gaze made him feel like he could be honest. "I'm in trouble," Ethan said quietly. "I'm being accused of a crime I didn't commit. I need to figure out how to fight this." Mr. Langford's eyes softened, and he pulled up a chair across from Ethan. "Well, you're in luck. I know a thing or two about this stuff." Ethan looked at him, surprised. "You do?" "I'm not a lawyer, but I've studied law in my time," Mr. Langford explained. "Let's take a look at what you've got here." For the next hour, Mr. Langford patiently helped Ethan piece together the basics of courtroom strategy. He talked about how to present facts in the most compelling way, how to make a jury see the truth, and most importantly, how to plant doubt in the minds of those who might try to convict him. "It's not just about the facts, Ethan," Mr. Langford said, tapping a finger on the table. "It's about how you present them, how you ask the right questions and make them see that something doesn't add up." Ethan soaked up every word. This was the kind of help he needed. Mr. Langford didn't just teach him about law, he gave him the tools to believe in himself again. By the time Ethan left the library, his notebook was full of notes, questions to ask, evidence to challenge, strategies to use. He wasn't just preparing for court, he was preparing for a battle. The fight wasn't just for his innocence anymore, it was for justice, for everyone who had ever been wrongfully accused. But he knew it wouldn't be easy. The courtroom wouldn't be like the library. It wouldn't be a quiet place where he could look things up. It would be loud, intense, and full of people who might not care whether he was guilty or not. Still, Ethan wasn't afraid anymore. He was ready. The day of the trial finally arrived, and Ethan Harper stood nervously at the defendant's table, his heart pounding in his chest. The courtroom was full, the air thick with tension. The walls were lined with old wood and books, the smell of coffee and stale paper filling the room. The judge, an older man with silver hair and deep lines on his face, sat high above them, watching over the proceedings with an expression that was as unreadable as stone. Ethan's public defender, Mark Jenkins, sat beside him, flipping through his notes like he hadn't even read them. He barely looked at Ethan, his attention fixed on his papers. Ethan could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He wasn't going to get any help from Jenkins. This was his fight, and it was up to him to make sure he was heard. Across the room, Officer Brian Shaw sat rigidly in his uniform, his arms crossed over his chest. His face was impassive, but Ethan could see the confidence radiating off him. Shaw didn't think he was going to lose this case. He thought it was already over. The prosecutor, a woman in a navy blue suit, stood and began her opening statement. Her voice was sharp, precise, cutting through the room like a knife. "Your Honor," she said, turning to the judge, "the evidence is clear. The defendant was seen near the crime scene, matching the description given in the security footage. Officer Shaw, a veteran officer with over 20 years of experience, detained the defendant based on probable cause. We believe this case speaks for itself." Ethan clenched his fists under the table, feeling the anger build inside him. Probable cause. Those two words were what had gotten him here in the first place. The prosecutor continued, walking toward the jury, her voice smooth and confident. "The store was broken into, goods were stolen, and who was seen nearby? The defendant. The hoodie, the sneakers, The timing, it all adds up. Ethan gritted his teeth. This wasn't right. It wasn't enough. He had done nothing wrong. And yet, here he was, accused of something he hadn't done, and the prosecutor was trying to make it seem like the case was already decided. When the prosecutor finished, it was time for Mark Jenkins to speak. Ethan barely had time to prepare for what he was about to hear. Jenkins adjusted his tie, cleared his throat, and stood. "My client maintains his innocence," Jenkins muttered, his voice flat. "We intend to show that the evidence does not conclusively prove he committed this crime." That was it. That was all he had to say. Ethan wanted to scream. He could feel the frustration bubbling inside him, but he held it in. He knew what he had to do. The judge turned to him. "Mr. Harper, I understand you wish to speak on your own behalf?" Ethan's heart raced, but he didn't hesitate. He stood, his legs shaking, but his resolve solid. His mother, sitting behind him, was holding her breath. He glanced over at the jury, their eyes fixed on him. This was his chance. "Yes, Your Honor," Ethan said, his voice steady. He took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the room. "I would like to talk about the evidence." The room fell silent as he turned toward the prosecutor's table. He pointed at the screen where the security footage was about to be played. "Where is the footage?" he asked, his voice cutting through the silence. The prosecutor hesitated, then nodded toward the screen, and the grainy footage began to play. A figure in a hoodie moved quickly past the store's broken window. The person's face was obscured, and it was hard to make out much of anything. The footage was shaky, unclear, and didn't give any real detail. Ethan folded his arms. "That's it?" he asked, his voice steady. "That's the evidence? You're telling me that this blurry video is enough to accuse me of a crime I didn't commit?" The prosecutor frowned, clearly caught off guard. "That is you." Ethan shook his head. "No, it's not. It's just a figure in a hoodie. You can't prove that's me." He turned to the judge, his mind racing. "Your Honor, may I ask Officer Shaw a question?" The judge nodded. Ethan looked straight at Shaw. "Officer Shaw, how tall am I?" Shaw blinked, clearly thrown off by the question. I don't know. I'm guessing about 5 feet 4 inches." Ethan pointed at the screen. "Then tell me why the store's security camera logs say the suspect is 5 feet 9 inches. How do you explain that?" A tense silence fell over the courtroom. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably in her seat, and Shaw's jaw tightened. Ethan's pulse raced, but he didn't back down. This was it. He had just exposed a critical flaw in their case. "Your Honor," Ethan continued, "the suspect in that video is much taller than I am. The camera system logs the height of the suspect based on a scale near the door, designed to measure people during a robbery. The footage shows the suspect walking past that scale, and if you look closely, you'll see that the person is at least 5 feet 9 inches, not 5 feet 4 inches. So it couldn't have been me." The judge leaned forward, his eyes narrowing at the prosecutor. "Do you have an explanation for this discrepancy?" The prosecutor's lips pressed into a thin line. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Ethan stood his ground, his heart pounding in his chest, but his voice was calm. "This isn't just about a hoodie or sneakers. This is about proving guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. And right now, there's doubt all over this case." The room was silent. Ethan had just put a massive crack in their case. He didn't know if he'd won yet, but for the first time, he felt like he had a chance. The courtroom felt different as Ethan Harper stood there, waiting for the judge's decision. His heart raced, his palms sweating. He had done everything he could, exposed the flaws in the case, and pointed out the discrepancies in the evidence. But would it be enough? The judge, with his deep wrinkles and silver hair, sat high above, looking down at Ethan. He cleared his throat and spoke. "We will take a brief recess before the jury deliberates," the judge announced, his voice steady. "I'd like to have a word with the prosecution and defense in my chambers." Ethan's stomach twisted. He was so close, but still the uncertainty weighed heavily on him. Janet Harper, his mother, reached out and squeezed his shoulder, her touch grounding him. "You did great," she whispered, her voice full of pride. But Ethan wasn't celebrating yet. 20 minutes later, everyone returned to the courtroom. The judge resumed his seat, and the jury filed in, their expressions unreadable. The foreman stood up, and the entire room held its breath. "Have you reached a verdict?" the judge asked. The foreman nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." All eyes were on Ethan as the foreman turned to the judge. "On the charge of burglary, we find the defendant, Ethan Harper, not guilty." A wave of relief washed over Ethan, but it didn't feel like the overwhelming rush of victory he had imagined. It was more like a weight lifting off his shoulders, like the heavy fog that had been hanging over him for weeks was finally beginning to clear. Before Ethan could fully process the moment, the judge turned to the prosecutor. "After reviewing the evidence and the new information presented, I am instructing the district attorney's office to open an internal investigation into Officer Shaw's conduct." Ethan's eyes widened in shock as Officer Brian Shaw's face turned a deep shade of red. The prosecutor's protest was immediate, but the judge's words had already cast a shadow over Shaw. Ethan's heart raced again. Shaw had thought he would walk away scot-free, but now everything had changed. The judge raised his hand, silencing Shaw's objections. "This court has seen enough to question whether you should even be wearing that badge," the judge said firmly. Ethan stood frozen, feeling a strange sense of justice. The world had tilted in his favor, but it wasn't just about him anymore. Shaw had been exposed for his wrongdoings, and this was about making sure this didn't happen to anyone else. The gavel came down. "This trial is adjourned." When the sound of the gavel echoed through the room, Ethan felt like a weight had been lifted. Janet Harper immediately rushed toward him, pulling him into a tight embrace. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered through her tears. Ethan wanted to say something, but all he could do was stand there overwhelmed. This battle was over, but he knew it wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had ever been wrongfully accused. As they left the courthouse, the bright sunlight outside felt different. The air was fresher, more open. Ethan had walked in as a defendant and walked out as a free man. At the courthouse steps, reporters swarmed, their cameras flashing, microphones thrusting toward him. One reporter called out, "How does it feel to prove your innocence?" Ethan looked at the cameras, his mother beside him, steadying him. He could have said he felt relieved, but instead he took a deep breath and said, "I shouldn't have had to prove my innocence." A silence fell over the crowd. The truth hung heavy in the air. This wasn't just about his case. It was about a broken system, a system that forced innocent people to fight for their freedom. As they walked past the crowd, Mr. Langford, the school librarian, called out from the steps. Ethan saw him standing there with a few of his classmates. "You did it," Langford said, nodding in approval. Ethan swallowed hard. "Yeah, but what about the kids who don't get the chance?" Langford gave him a knowing look. "Maybe it's your job to make sure they do." Those words struck Ethan hard. The fight wasn't over. It wasn't just about him anymore. He wasn't done. The battle was just beginning. A week later, the investigation into Shaw's conduct hit the news, and more stories surfaced. Other kids, other wrongfully accused individuals. Ethan had won, but he knew his fight wasn't just for himself. In the school library, notebook in hand, Ethan approached Langford. "I want to help kids like me," he said, "so this never happens again." Langford smiled. "Then you'd better get to work." Ethan nodded, his purpose clear. He had won his case, but the real fight was just beginning.